everyone, my name is Jacqueline. I'm the Director of Programs for HumanitiesDC. I want to welcome you all to this event. I would like to begin with a video about HumanitiesDC just to explain who we are.
When I think about the humanities, what I think about are our history, our values, our ideas, and our culture.
There are things that touch us in our soul and our spirit that makes us feel like we're connected to something bigger than who we are.
It's also going back to remember those that have come before us who have framed these communities.
I don't really know how you can live without the humanities and the arts.
Discovering the tapestry of our nation's capital through its stories, its neighborhoods, and its citizens is the mission of HumanitiesDC. Through its many grants and programs, HumanitiesDC reaches more than 660,000 residents in each of the district's 8 wards.
This is an amazingly diverse place. It's diverse from the point of view of American history and populations, but it's also increasingly diverse with respect to international or trans-global populations, people coming from all over the world to live here.
A grant from HumanitiesDC enabled filmmaker Shalay Hainsworth to continue her Black Broadway on You project.
HumanitiesDC, they understood the importance of this movement of the digital humanities and preserving the history, the humanities, the cultures, and art in the digital space.
HumanitiesDC's Soul of the City received $40,000 from the Pulitzer Prize Board for innovative youth educational summer programs.
Well, quite frankly, the Soul of the City changed my life.
HumanitiesDC's Community Heritage Project helps newcomers better understand their neighborhood.
Gentrification, it's everywhere. How do they understand what's happening to them, to their communities? And the humanities are a way of doing that.
HumanitiesDC is a strategic partner to the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities.
They exist to actually manage programs in humanities that we don't have the capacity to manage. They have a very vibrant organization, so I see them as a partner.
Where happy hour meets the humanities. That's the think and drink definition of a Humanitini. These happy hour conversations bring panels of academics, cultural curators, musicians, and many experts for lively conversation and debate.
It is an opportunity for young people to come out and learn through panel discussions about the city, about its neighborhoods, about its history, and most importantly, about its politics.
We have a bookstore. We have authors that come here and talk. We have poets. We have writers. All of these things are part of the humanities, is what makes us human.
The common denominator in all of these programs is HumanitiesDC. We invite you to support our mission. Give the gift of humanities to your fellow Washingtonians for years to come.
Okay. So again, my name is Jay Stewart. I'm from HumanitiesDC. I'm the program director. I'd like to thank you all for coming out on what would normally be a long weekend at the beach to hear our latest Humanitini. I'd like to thank our hosts, Busboys and Poets. I'd like to thank Alicia Bird, Denisha Bullock, Patrick Bonesteel, and AJ Head for their patience and help in putting this together. I'd also like to thank Marjan and Andy Shalal, seated in the back, for being our hosts. And I'd like to thank Steve Kolb, our videographer. I'd also like to thank our board members in attendance, Yolanda Alcorta and Monica Scott. Thank you all for being here. And I'd also like to thank our staff. To my right, your left, I'd like to identify Stephanie Scott, our administrator. Jasper Collier, the director of our digital museum. And is Joy here? Joy's out there, so when she comes in, we'll recognize her as well. I'd also like to thank the honorary committee, the mayor, the DC Council, DC Public Library Director Richard Reyes Gavilan, DC Archivist Becky Katz, Historical Society Director John Swow, Cultural Tourism DC Director Steve Schulman, DC Preservation League Director Rebecca Miller, and DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities Director Arthur Espinoza Jr. And joining us now is Joy Ford Austin, our Executive Director. I'd like to thank our sponsors, again, Busboys and Poets, for hosting us, also DC Brow and A Creative DC. HumanitiesDC is an independent, nonprofit affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the federal agency in charge of supporting the humanities throughout the United States. HumanitiesDC is an essential part of the district's effort to provide quality humanities-related programs that preserve Washington's cultural legacy and promote civic engagement in every neighborhood in DC. This year marks the 225th anniversary of the founding of the District of Columbia. As part of the celebration of this event, starting in January and continuing monthly for the rest of the year, we're holding panel discussions of scholars and contemporary commentators to discuss the highlights of a series of 20-year periods in the history of the district and to link the events of the past to present-day issues and concerns of district residents. HumanitiesDC hopes to illuminate the often overlooked local history of the nation's capital and to define aspects of a unique contemporary culture of the district. Given the cultural and economic changes taking place in this city, we believe that reflecting on what our history has to teach us about the present is both timely and important. Today's topic is DC as a laboratory of democracy. The historical time period that we're covering this month is the years from 1951 to 1971. On May 17, 1954, the United States Supreme Court decided the Brown versus Board of Education case calling for this racial desegregation of the nation's schools. This pivotal moment in American history is also a unique part of DC history, since the court handed down its opinion in a DC school desegregation case, Bolling v. Sharpe, on the same day. Bolling v. Sharpe applied specifically to the District of Columbia. Because DC is a federal enclave, the Brown decision, which only concerned the states, had no impact. The efforts of concerned parents, such as Gardner Bishop, the parents of Marguerite Carr, the parents of Spotswood Bolling Jr., and their attorneys, Howard Law professors Charles Houston, James Nabrit, and George Hayes, made the difference in the nation's capital. This story forms the basis for a discussion this evening about DC as a laboratory for experiments in federal social policy. The Bolling decision is universally regarded as a positive step in achieving racial reconciliation and strengthening democracy in the district. Subsequent attempts to revise, limit, or quash DC laws in the present day have been less well received. Examples include congressional interventions in the areas of gun safety, reproductive rights, the local school system, the legalization of marijuana, and clean needle exchanges for substance abusers. Other more neutral federal-local interactions include the recent federal decision to cede control to the DC government of Kingman Island, the nature preserve which today serves as a living classroom for DC school children. Here today to help us consider the topic is a panel of distinguished experts. Bryce Celotto, is a graduate student at Brown University focusing on the field of education. Mary Elliott is a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution National Museum of African American History and Culture. Kevin Hilgers is a staff attorney at the DC Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. Pamela Perkins is the founder and CEO of the Human Communication Institute, LLC, and an adjunct professor of speech at the UDC Community College. Last but not least, Jacqueline Thomsen is managing editor of the George Washington University Hatchet. Pamela?
Good evening. Welcome to Humanitini. How many of you have your Humanitini? Or something of that sort with you, right? Well, I wouldn't be the moderator if I didn't take a little sip before I started. I won't drink the whole thing in front of you. But I do want to toast you this evening for being here. Welcome once again. And I am very honored to be here to represent DC Humanities, HumanitiesDC. It's just an incredible group. Do we need the humanities to thrive? Let me ask, do we need the humanities to thrive? Yes, we do. It is the only thing that's going to bring us together. I am a proponent for STEM, but I need to move over for STEAM. So that, yes, right? And I think this is across the board. I think people understand this. So I'm excited as a humanities person to know that my passion is not dying. I'm the founder of the Human Communication Institute. I consider myself a communications practitioner. When I say the word practitioner, most of you think medical. Well, we're talking mental, medical, emotional, and anything you can think of in terms of healing and development of our humanity one to another. And so the Institute is dedicated to improving the communication climate of families, communities, institutions, our society at large. And so I'm very honored, and I thank Jay and Joy and the rest of the staff for letting me be here today. So let's get started. We're going to start with something very exciting, something that we've been waiting for a minute here. So I'd like to introduce, and I have to do my job, so you don't get up yet, okay? Let me make an arrangement here with my eyes, and I'm going to introduce you to Mary Elliott. She is museum specialist for the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. We need to applaud right there. Right? I'm so excited. Mary Elliott is a museum specialist and co-curator of the Slavery and Freedom inaugural exhibition at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. In her current position, she has helped research, conceptualize, and design the Slavery and Freedom inaugural exhibition. She has also contributed to the exhibition script, consulted with expert scholars, and identified and secured collection donations, including the antebellum slave cabin that will be featured in the museum. I think my mama has some things you might need, but I'll get in touch with you. Okay, we've been trying to get her to get rid of some stuff, so, okay. No, really, okay. A graduate of Howard University and the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law, Mary helped produce local history exhibits in Washington, D.C. area and produced several public history programs. She served as a contractor and consultant to various organizations, including the National Visionary Leadership Project, Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland, African American History, and the Humanities Council of Washington, D.C. She has over 20 years of experience in researching and presenting African American history and culture. Please join me in welcoming Mary Elliott.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you for welcoming me this evening, and it is an honor for me to be here this evening because I feel like it's a homecoming. I can tell you for a fact that while I do have quite a bit of experience, but for my experience working with the Washington, D.C. Humanities Council and the guidance of Joy Ford Austin, I probably wouldn't be standing here in front of you this evening. So I have to acknowledge her as one of my mentors and key supporters, so thank you, Joy. Yeah, and it feels like a family reunion because I also know Jay from the Washington Bar Association. We served on the board together. So this is a pleasure for me to be here tonight, and I also have to acknowledge one of our very important elders in the audience, and that is Dory Ladner, civil rights activist, pioneer. So it's an honor to be here to present in front of her this evening. I love her to death, and we had a wonderful time catching up with each other recently, but when I saw her come in today, it was like seeing family. So I'm glad she's here this evening. So one of the things I have to point out is I watched that wonderful video, and some of the things that were mentioned were history, values, culture, something bigger than ourselves, prompting us to remember and think more deeply about our history. At the heart of the humanities is the story of humanity, right? So we really do try to present that in the new museum. And I'm just going to briefly tell you about the museum, and it will be very brief, but just give you a taste of some of the things that you'll be in for when you come to the new museum. And we're very excited about it opening here in Washington, D.C., and for everyone's support. So we can go to the next slide. So the power of place. That's very important when you think about this museum. We are the 19th Smithsonian Museum, and we are expected to be the last one on the mall. Next slide, thank you. You see that we are positioned right next to the Washington Monument. We are right beside the National Museum of American History, and our exhibitions will complement the exhibitions in American history just as theirs will complement ours. The key thing is for all of us to go into these museums and really think about what it means to be American. Next slide, please. Think about the position of this museum. We are right by the Jefferson Memorial, the Capitol Building, the Lincoln Memorial, the White House, and again, as I mentioned, the National Monument. Next slide, please. The design of the museum, a lot of people have asked about that, and this design is based on a corona that's at the top of this veranda post, a veranda post that was featured in architectural design in Western Africa. And so the three tiers that you see on top, our museum design mimics those three tiers. But what you should understand is the lattice design that you see on the panels that go around the building are based on an algorithm that was designed based on the ironworks of blacksmiths in South Carolina and Louisiana. There's a lot of thought that's been put into this museum, the design from the time you approach outside until you go inside. There's a porch on the front because we think of the porch as the gathering place in the Black community, and we hope that you all will gather there and think and talk about what you see inside as well as what you think about as you come out of the museum. Next slide, please. And again, this is another image of those panels and the corona design. Next slide, thank you. This is kind of a peek into the inside of the museum. It's not exactly, some of those objects aren't exactly placed in those places, except I will tell you, the segregated rail car was actually dropped into the museum, and we actually had to build around it. That's an 80-ton rail car. It took two 500-ton cranes to drop it into the museum. And you will have the opportunity to walk through it and hear voices from the period so that you can reflect on that time period, that period of segregation when we were defining and defending freedom. We will, of course, have the Edisto Island slave cabin built in 1853 that we were able to secure from Edisto Island, South Carolina. And, of course, we have the trainer plane from the Tuskegee Airmen's trainer plane that a young couple actually restored and then flew it across country and brought it to the museum and donated it to us. Next slide, thank you. So really quickly, there are three galleries: the History Gallery, the Community Gallery, and the Culture Gallery. And of course, Slavery and Freedom is part of that History Gallery, and you can see we have a section on segregation, 1968 and beyond, which brings us up to today. Culture includes musical crossroads, cultural expressions, taking the stage in visual arts. And community is about power, place, making a way out of no way, military and sports. Just quickly, Power Place will feature different sites throughout the country that are specifically unique to or specifically important to the African American experience, but very much part of the American story. And then Making a Way Out of No Way focuses on institutions like the church, fraternities, sororities, different civic organizations, cultural organizations, community groups. Next slide, thank you. So really quickly, going through slavery and freedom, we want you to know, next slide, thank you, that when we look at the exhibition, we don't just look at the place, we look at the people. So when you normally see the story of slavery, you think of the big house and people in the field. Next, thank you. But if you notice, we zoom in on the people. Next slide, thank you. This is what we want you to focus on. So when we talk about the humanities and we talk about the human story, we talk about the people. Next slide, thank you. Shaping the nation. Next slide. This is a swamp from Low Country, South Carolina. When we talk about shaping the nation, we talk about the contributions of African Americans to this nation, culturally, politically, economically, socially. They took these swamplands from this, next slide, thank you, to this, the rice fields of South Carolina. These rice fields produced a lot of profit, which begat power. And this is what we want people to think about, how African Americans helped build this nation in many ways. Next slide, thank you. This is what we think of in terms of profit and power. Next slide. Juxtaposed to that is the human story. The human story allows us to look at, for example, Solomon Williams, who was a blacksmith at a plantation down in Louisiana. We don't just tell the story of Solomon got up at 4 a.m., ate a pound cake, went out to the fields. We don't talk about Solomon Williams as someone who got up at 4 a.m., ate pound cake, went out into the fields, worked the fields from a certain hour to a certain hour, then went back in, ate food again, laid down, rested, got up, and did it all over again. We actually talk about people like Solomon Williams from a very human story. Next slide, please. We talk about Solomon Williams and we look at life, work, and enslavement. He had a multi-layered life, a multi-layered story. Work. This is a drill bit designed by Solomon Williams, who had no education. This in itself looks like a piece of artwork. It was meticulously designed, and we are able to feature that in the exhibition. Next slide, please. Life. Those same skills that this blacksmith had, he was able to create the grave markers for his community members. This is the grave marker, intricately designed, very artistic, for his wife's gravesite. Next slide, please. Enslavement. No doubt, as the blacksmith on the plantation, Solomon Williams was also responsible for creating the restraints that were used on the enslaved on that same plantation. That gives you many layers of this man's life beyond just work. Next slide. Thank you. The power of objects. Next slide. Thank you. This is something that people might not expect. Fox's wage book. This is actually a wage book of the crew members who served on the slave ship. Many of those crew members committed suicide or ran away. We want people to know that this is a full story. It's told through the African American experience, but this is a shared history. So you will learn about Black, white, American Indian, everyone involved in this collective history. Next slide, please. This is a powder horn that was used by Prince Simbo, who served in the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War is very much an American story. You cannot help but think about what that fight for liberty and freedom meant to these men and women. Next slide, please. We have the slave dealer's business card, which very much talks about the business of the slave trade. This was a business, and it helped build the nation in terms of money. It helped build institutions. So we are happy to feature things like this that prompt us to think a little more deeply. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have a handheld emancipation proclamation that was carried by African American soldiers in the Union Army to inform African Americans on the various plantations that they were now free. Finally, as we go to the end, next slide, beyond our walls. I just want to share with you that but for the support of the community, we wouldn't be able to get objects like these. The slave cabin from Edisto Island, South Carolina. and you see community members, elders, and descendants of the enslaved, as well as descendants of the slave-holding families, gathered together on that site as we dismantled the cabin and helped us unfold the story, the history, this community story, this regional story, this national story, and global story, so that we can bring it to you. I do want to share with you the young lady, and I do mean young lady, that you see in this picture. We're very heartbroken, but we are going to make sure that we pay homage to her, that she actually just passed away 2 weekends ago. So I want you to know the people who have been great stewards of this history, who will not be there with us today on the 24th, but they will be with us in spirit. And it's because of them that we're able to bring these stories to you. Next slide, please. Finally, we want you to know that we reach out all over the world and throughout these communities to bring you these stories. And lastly, next slide. Thank you. This is the museum. So we look forward to seeing you all on the 24th, if not before then, and definitely after that. So thank you.
Okay. Who's ready to go to the museum? Right? Well, guess what? I live right around the corner. So you'll see me first in line when I can get there. Thank you so much. I am very honored. My ancestors are honored. And as humanity, we're honored for this to happen finally. So we need to move into tonight. And I didn't know until I was told that the Brown versus Board of Education did not effectually desegregate schools here in Washington, D.C. So I had to do my homework to find out, well, what happened? How did that happen? And so I was researching and seeing how the Fifth Amendment had been used to bring that to us here in D.C., and even still, it's a controversy. So tonight we have speakers that are going to answer that controversy. I ask that as an audience member, would you please, if you have questions that arise during the process, could you write them down so that we can attend to them? Otherwise, I have to come up with your questions, and you don't want me to do that. No, really, I can do it, but I'd rather not. We want to hear from you. And so we're going to start with our first speaker today, and I will introduce him. You've already met him, Mr. Bryce Celotto, like gelato. Oh, I got it now. I really have it. So let me introduce him, and then we can hear from this wonderful contributor. He is an MAT candidate, Brown University social justice activist. Bryce is an emerging educational professional who is currently a Master of Art in Teaching, has a Master's of Art in Teaching candidate, or he's getting it, at Brown University, focusing on teaching social studies, history in grades 7 through 12. You ready for grade 7 through? All right, okay. Get ready. Okay, Bryce has been working at the intersections of social justice policy and education for the past 6 years. Bryce holds an associate's degree in liberal arts and science at Holyoke Community College, graduating with high honors and as a Commonwealth Honors Scholar. He is also alumnus of the Honors College at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and where he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in history, graduating magna cum laude. Congratulations. And as a member of several honor societies, including Phi Alpha Theta. During his senior year at UMass, Bryce served as a teaching assistant in an introduction to American government, and that was a part of the transition program, a specialized program for freshmen. Bryce's primary interests in history include United States history, African American history, LGBTQ history, gender studies, and Bryce's award-winning senior thesis, Bolling versus Sharpe and Beyond, the unfinished and untold story of school desegregation in Washington, D.C. is why we have him here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bryce Celotto. All right.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, yeah, thank you for that great introduction, and thank you, Mary, for your introduction of the African American History Museum. I'm going the Monday that it opens, and I'm really excited. Okay. So yeah, you can go ahead, next slide, Jay. So I'm going to be talking about the Bolling v. Sharpe case and a little bit more about school desegregation here in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to go over a general timeline of public schools here in D.C. I'm also going to touch a little bit on the difference between de jure and de facto segregation. And I know those sound like really fancy words, but trust me, I'll break them down and they're not as fancy as they seem. I'm going to talk about John Philip Sousa Junior High School and then go into the case. You can have the next slide. Cool. So just like a brief historical timeline about Washington, D.C., because it's really hard to tell this story without providing some historical context. So as Jay said, it's the 225th anniversary of Washington, D.C. So historians like to argue about whether or not D.C. was founded in 1790 or 1791. It's like a super nerdy argument. So 1790, 1791, Washington, D.C. was established as a territory of the United States. Of course, George Washington then gets Charles L'Enfant to design the city, and by 1800, the city is open for business to the federal government. So 2 years later, in 1802, the Charter of Washington City, because D.C.'s original name was not Washington, D.C., it was actually 3 separate little territories, and Washington City was what it was known by. So in 1802, white students get access to public schools in Washington, D.C., and only white students. That's a very important part of the story. It is not until 1862 when African-American students get public schools in Washington, D.C. So already African-American students in D.C. are 60 years behind white students. You can hit. So that being said, another really important thing that happened right after 1862 was Plessy v. Ferguson is decided, of course, in 1896. Now, most people would not think of Plessy v. Ferguson as an education history case or as an education case. But in many ways, Plessy v. Ferguson was an education case. Because what Plessy v. Ferguson did that was really important was that it set the standard saying de jure segregation is okay. So it's okay to segregate black and white people by the basis of the law. So Plessy v. Ferguson set that case law, which is why it's really important. So de jure segregation simply means a law that creates segregation, a very specific law, versus de facto segregation, which I can talk about later and you guys can ask me questions about, is when social conditions create segregation. So things like white flight, when all the white people left D.C. in the 50s and 60s and moved to the suburbs, that is another form of creating segregation. So next slide. So that being said, fast forward to the 50s. Sorry about that. Fast forward to the 50s. So 1950, John Philip Sousa Junior High School is opened in Washington, D.C. in the Anacostia neighborhood. And at the time the school opens, it's the nicest middle school in Washington, D.C. It's right across from a golf course. There's beautiful classrooms. There's an auditorium. It's like the top-notch middle school in Washington, D.C. But the problem is it's for white students only. And even though the school was half empty when it opens, when the school opens, there's plenty of room for anyone who wanted to go to school there to go to school there. But the D.C. school board said, nope, we're making the school whites only, keeping with the de jure segregated school. So there were white schools and black schools. And you can get the next slide. A parent, Nick Gardner Bishop, so he's the man in that photo. Gardner Bishop was actually from North Carolina, which also is kind of unique to the story because so much of DC activism and DC history often starts with people who are from DC. But in this case, you had Gardner Bishop, who was a barber, actually. His barber shop was right down the street from here. He was a very well-known, well-renowned barber, and he really didn't mean to become a community activist. He was just a concerned parent who had some kids, and he wanted his kids to have a fair education. He was a black man with black children. He wanted his kids to have a fair shot. So Gardner Bishop founded the Consolidated Parents Group, which was a community organization of fellow concerned parents. So what makes the Bolling case really unique from the other Brown v. Board cases? And I also want to clarify one more thing. There's a huge misconception in history and in the way Brown v. Board is taught that Brown v. Board was one case. That's not true. Brown v. Board was an umbrella of multiple school desegregation cases that were all packed together into one neat little headline, which was Brown v. Board. But in reality, Brown v. Board of Education covered the case in Kansas, which is the one most people know about. There was a case in South Carolina, there was a case in Delaware, there was a case in Virginia. Those all fall under the Brown v. Board umbrella. And technically, the Bolling v. Sharpe case is also underneath the Brown v. Board umbrella. But what made Bolling really different from the other Brown cases was two huge things. So it started with grassroots organizing. None of the other cases, none of the cases in Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, none of those really started with people in the community. All of those cases were the NAACP coming in from the outside, going into those communities and saying, hey, we've run... Whoa. That was like an air horn. So all the other cases were the NAACP coming from the outside into those communities saying, we've run test cases, we know we can do this, let us help you. But in DC, it was completely different. Gardner Bishop didn't even trust the NAACP. Gardner Bishop was very much a working class black man, and he was very, very weary of what he called uppity Negroes. And he considered a lot of the folks in the NAACP to be uppity. He considered them to be upper middle class black people who didn't care about working class black people. So Gardner Bishop did not trust the NAACP. And that was one really big reason why the Bolling v. Sharpe case is the only case that went to the Supreme Court that won as a school desegregation case that was not argued by the NAACP. It was lawyers from Howard University Law School that argued the case and won the case. So Charles Hamilton Houston was the dean of Howard University Law, as well as the head of the NAACP. Unfortunately, he passed away right before the case went to court, but his mentee, James Nabrit, took over the case, as well as George E.C. Hayes. So it was not the NAACP. It was Howard University Law School lawyers who took over this case and won, which is a really cool distinguishing factor when you're talking about Bolling. And then Jay alluded to this, and others have alluded to this. Washington, D.C.'s standing as a territory and not a state also really made this case unique. So the other Brown cases were argued on the basis of the 14th Amendment, specifically the Equal Protection Clause. But the Equal Protection Clause is very, very specific and applying to states and states only. So, to argue the Bolling case, what George E.C. Hayes and James Nabrit did was they used the Fifth Amendment, specifically the stance on liberty and due process. So this is really innovative and really radical, because at the time, everyone thought they were crazy. No one thought they would win this case by saying, their basic argument was, you can't segregate schools in Washington, D.C. because you're denying African American students their right to due process and liberty. No one thought that would work, because it sounds, quite frankly, excuse my language, batshit crazy. But for them, it worked. So that's another really big distinguishing factor. You can go to the next slide. Almost done. So, again, Howard University Law was a really big part of this. So there's Charles Hamilton Houston on my left, your right, I guess. And he, again, passed away right before the case started. But he's really the man that convinced Gardner Bishop to take it to court. Because like I said before, he was really weary of this idea of the law and legal policies. He thought it was like too much. It was too uppity for Gardner Bishop. He was just like a working class man from North Carolina. So before they took the case to court, they were picketing and stuff. But Charles Hamilton Houston met with Gardner Bishop and said, if you want to win, let me help you. We don't have to do this through the NAACP. We can do this the way you want. So he was the guy who convinced them to take it to court. And then, of course, you have George E.C. Hayes and James Nabrit talking about the case. Next slide. And just to conclude, so again, the district standing as a territory was really, really unique and helped this case go forward. And another thing, the biggest thing I want to emphasize, though, really, is that everyday African Americans who lived in D.C. is why this case went to court and why this case won. If it wasn't for folks like Gardner Bishop, if it wasn't for Spotswood T. Bolling, where you get the namesake Bolling v. Sharpe, he was a 12-year-old boy. You know, no one would have thought a 12-year-old black boy from Southeast D.C. would ever get his name on a Supreme Court case in the United States, especially in 1952, 53, 54, and this is all happening. And then I can talk about this more later during Q&A, but really the next 20 years, so even after the Bolling decision, D.C. public schools really struggled to desegregate schools, because what you saw was the Bolling case ended de jure segregation. So again, it ended that segregation by law. It ended a law says there's black schools and a law says there's white schools, but it did not end segregation in Washington, D.C. public schools. Still to this day, DCPS is one of the most segregated school districts in the United States. And a lot of that is because of de facto segregation, which again, I'm more than happy to answer questions about later. So thank you so much, and I really am looking forward to your questions.
Yes. It's time for him to graduate, don't you think? I mean, he has an A. I have been taken to school. I really have. Have we not? Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was incredible. Wow. Well, we're moving on. And again, remember, we're talking about DC as a laboratory of democracy. And this is a good example. But we set the pace. We set the pace. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, which is Kevin Hilgers. He is a staff attorney of the DC Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. His portfolio includes the DC Democracy, Care First Reform, affordable housing, and LEAD projects. His prior experience includes the Council of the District of Columbia's Office of the General Counsel and Committee on Government, Operations, and the Environment. Kevin also previously worked as a journalist reporting for the Associated Press, the current newspapers in Northwest Washington, and the Gazette in Prince George's County. Kevin is a graduate of the University of Baltimore School of Law and holds bachelor's degree in journalism and Russian from American University. He is also a member of the bar in the District of Columbia and Maryland. Let me make sure I got all of you. And please join me in welcoming Kevin Hilgers.
Thanks, Pamela, and thanks to HumanitiesDC for having us all out here, and great presentations by Mary and Bryce. And there's a lot of history there on Bolling v. Sharpe that we're all a lot smarter for. So Pamela's talking about DC as a laboratory for democracy, but what I want to talk about a little bit more is DC as a laboratory for undemocracy, because that's one of the things that I work on at DC Appleseed is making sure that DC has the right to make its own decisions, just like every other city and state in the country, without its local decisions by its locally elected officials being second-guessed by a legislature, the Congress, in which the residents have no voting representation. So what the DC Appleseed does is we engage the many lawyers here in DC pro bono to help solve some of the biggest problems facing the District of Columbia. And like I said, one of those is the lack of democracy here in DC. And one of the ways that manifests itself is how the courts and the Congress treat DC's gun laws. So we've been working at DC Appleseed on two fronts there. One's in the courts, and one is with Congress. And it's really about more than just about guns and gun safety, but about how DC residents and DC officials are treated, unlike any other. So on the courts, let me just run quickly through the most recent 10 years of gun litigation in the federal courts here in DC. So it's been, I guess, 8 years or so since the Supreme Court issued its decision in District of Columbia versus Heller, where the court held narrowly that there's an individual Second Amendment right to have a gun in the home for protection. And with that, the Supreme Court struck down DC's long-standing, pretty much a ban on having an operable handgun in the home. And that was a law passed by the local DC government, and it was struck down by the court in a big decision nationwide that a lot of gun rights advocates and gun safety advocates had an eye on. And we filed an amicus brief in that case in the Supreme Court, asking, urging the court to give deference to the local DC Council on making these really difficult decisions of balancing public safety and rights for what was best for their jurisdiction. So there have been a number of cases since then, since Heller didn't really lay out how we're going to analyze these laws beyond flat bans. There's registration requirements, there's fingerprinting requirements, so courts have upheld some of those laws in DC and struck down some of them. But what the new frontier nationwide and in DC for gun laws is, what do we do about guns outside the home? What do we do about concealed carry in DC? And there are two cases now going to the DC Circuit on appeal. In one case, the lower court judge issued an injunction against DC's concealed carry licensing requirements, and in the other case, the judge upheld them. And what DC says now is that you can get a concealed carry license if you can show a good reason to have that, or to have a need for concealed carry license. So that's being challenged in the D.C. Circuit, and that will be argued in the D.C. Circuit on September 20th. Both of those cases. It would be very interesting to see where that goes. All the circuits that have dealt with these laws have, with similar laws, have upheld them, saying that, okay, well, the government's found a compelling reason to have these laws, and the good reason requirements has a tight fit with achieving those laws, and they've upheld them. Meanwhile, while these gun rights advocates have really been focused on the courts to advance their goals, Congress is also watching the courts carefully as well. There's many in Congress who are advocates of what they see as the Second Amendment rights. And there's an opportunity as the legislature for the district to impose their will and their ideas of what the gun laws should be here in D.C. This is really important because this sort of sets the stage for where we are now with D.C. rights vis-a-vis Congress. So around the same time that Heller came out, D.C. was also considering, or Congress was considering a really important bill that would have given D.C. a vote in the House of Representatives. The compromise was that D.C. would get a vote in the House, and Utah, a Republican-leaning state, would get another vote in the House, so that it wouldn't upset the partisan balance. So it was all set to pass both houses, but a poison pill amendment was added, and this related to guns. It would have pretty much stripped all of D.C.'s locally enacted gun laws and limited the council's ability to undermine their authority to legislate on guns in the future. And that was not acceptable to the majority of D.C. leadership. And so the bill giving D.C. a vote in the House was pulled. And ever since then, that's been the closest D.C.'s come in a long time toward getting a vote in the House. Really, really important advancement. And that gun amendment killed it. And it didn't. That's not where the story ends. Now Congress knows that these poison pill amendments can be attached to other laws that might advance D.C. democracy. And it's not just guns, too. There's also, a few years ago, the Congress was considering a new law that would give D.C. budget autonomy. That's the right to spend its own locally raised dollars without an affirmative congressional appropriation. But I believe it was Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky who proposed a number of amendments that would have undermined unions in the district, undermined the gun laws in the district, the usual things that play well to his constituents. You can understand that, but obviously are not palatable to D.C. And the congressional D.C. budget autonomy bill, it went away after that. So Congress is putting up a lot of resistance, knowing that, okay, well, if we give D.C. some rights, it's not going to come without them paying a price on these issues. And probably the most famous way that Congress actually successfully imposed its will on D.C. residents is not through making new laws, but through telling D.C. how to spend its money. This is a result of the lack of budget autonomy over its own local dollars. So every year, the Congress adds riders to the Appropriations Act saying D.C. cannot spend its own locally raised dollars, the tax dollars you pay, the fees you pay on abortions for low-income folks, on enacting a regulatory regime for marijuana, for legal marijuana that the D.C. voters overwhelmingly ratified a few years ago in an initiative. So that's the, and there's more that are considered. So that's the state of D.C. democracy right now. But thank you.
So we're going to, thank you very much, Evan. That was very informative, and as you can see, we have a lot going on here in D.C. That is being attended to by a variety of young, brilliant, and dedicated professionals. And so we're glad to have them here in the audience with us tonight and speaking with us and carrying and picking up the torch, which is what needs to happen. So I'm ready to introduce our last presenter in terms of opening up our forum this evening, after which we will move to the stage and entertain questions from the audience. This is Miss Jacqueline Thomsen, and she is the managing editor of the G.W. Hatchet, George Washington University's independent student newspaper. In this position, she has helped to lead a team of more than 100 reporters and editors, overseeing all news coverage for the award-winning newspaper, and is on her second term as secretary of Hatchet Publications. While Jacqueline does not consider herself to be an expert in politics or gun policies, she spent the summer working for The Trace, a nonprofit that solely covers gun violence and issues. There she gained experience writing about guns and the intricate political battles that surround the topic, including DC's gun laws and the federal scrutiny of those regulations. Previously, Jacqueline interned for Inside Higher Ed, covering national issues in higher education, and has been a staff member of the Hatchet for the past 3 years. She grew up in the Boston area, where her father is a sports writer. Her work has also been recognized by groups like the Society for Professional Journalists. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Jacqueline Hatchet.
Hi, thanks again to DC Humanities for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to try and keep this nice and quick so we're not covering things that Kevin talked about too. So I did work for The Trace this summer. It's a nonprofit. It covers gun issues, and I sincerely suggest that if you are interested in learning more about guns and gun policies, you check them out, thetrace.org. They're really great. So we move on to the first slide. So I want to start off talking about DC's existing laws because they're some of the most strict gun laws in the country. All firearms must be registered. All sales have to be done through a licensed dealer, which means that the city gets to figure out who has these guns and who is selling them. And concealed carry is allowed, but only with permission from the Metropolitan Police Department, which includes that good reason requirement that Kevin was talking about, and that is obviously currently being debated in court. So since 2010, there have been at least 7 attempts to repeal these gun laws. I'm showing a couple of those lawmakers that have done it. In 2015, Marco Rubio and another senator from Ohio, Jim Jordan, they introduced a bill that would have completely gutted all of DC's gun laws. That bill did not pass, fortunately, but 2 weeks later, Marco Rubio announced that he was going to be running for president, and that bill, having introduced it, helped him get some more support from Republicans in general. And Rand Paul also introduced a bill that would have also completely gutted all of DC's gun laws, and that was in December 2015. A few months later, announced his run for president. Now, this is Representative Thomas Massie. He is from Kentucky. Kentucky has some pretty relaxed gun laws, but he has tried at least 4 times to repeal all of DC's gun laws. He introduced a bill a few years back that Eleanor Holmes Norton got completely thrown out because there were a lot of technical mistakes in it. He rewrote it, fixed all those mistakes, got it introduced again, and went up for a vote. It died right there. 8 days after the mass shooting at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, he introduced 2 more bills that would have repealed some of DC's gun laws. They would have gotten rid of DC's gun-free zones, which are the ones by schools, in DC, and it also would have prevented DC lawmakers from being able to enforce the laws in terms of regulating who could carry a gun. A third measure was also introduced by a Republican lawmaker from Arizona, and that would have just taken away all funding from DC that allowed them to enforce gun laws. So the reason that a lot of these lawmakers introduce these sorts of bills are groups like the NRA. Just days after Marco Rubio announced that bill I was talking about earlier, his ranking was bumped from a B+ to an A by the NRA. And those are the sorts of rankings that how they determine who gets funding in terms of their elections. So that's a really big deal for them. So by passing and by introducing these bills in Congress that fortunately none of them have really passed, none of them have been signed into law, It's a way for them to gain these political points with groups like the NRA, with the Gun Owners of America, with these sorts of organizations that give them the money that can put them in those positions to repeal these laws. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about why it was important to talk about these sorts of things in DC specifically. Now, if you look at the number of recovered firearms, that is a huge amount of guns that have been taken off the streets in the past few years alone. And then if you look at the 20-year homicide trend, that's just the past 10 years, you'll see that spike from 2014 to 2015. That is a 54% jump in that 1 year alone. And if you look at the statistics from this year, it's only 10% fewer homicides from this point of this year than it was last year. And a majority of those are shootings that have happened with guns. So I wanted to touch a little bit on statehood and guns. This is something that Kevin talked a lot about, but having control over gun laws is one of the main arguments that are made for statehood. It has actually prevented statehood in the past, like Kevin talked about with the DC Voting Rights Act, passed in 2009, pulled in 2010 because of that poison bill. So I just wanted to wrap up by saying DC gun laws, they really remain a major target for these politicians who are hoping to gain these really easy and simple political points. But the fact is that you can't prevent these federal lawmakers from trying to pass these laws. None of them have passed, but it's still a threat that lies over DC lawmakers' heads and really can impact their day-to-day lives.
Very much. Wow, thank you. So, there's so much to absorb. There's so much going on that is crucial to all of us, our lives, our children, our communities. And so it's good to know that we all are here tonight because we want to be informed, we want to stay involved, and we want to support those that are doing that for us. So I congratulate. Let's give our panelists a round of applause, all of them. So we're going to transition right now. Thank you so much. We're going to transition right now to the stage, and it's your turn. So don't go anywhere. I mean, you can get another Humanitini if you want, but they're serving you. So please, we want to hear from you, and we'd love to have input, and they're here to answer your questions because you know every single one of them could have went on for another hour each, right? So they're biting at the bit now to say, what is it that you want to know that they may be able to support and help increase our knowledge. So I'm going to invite the panelists to the stage, including Miss Mary. You got to go? Okay, well, anyone want to say something to Miss Mary before she goes? Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll see you, just give us a minute and we're going to transition. Please join me on the stage. Are we on? Yes, we are. Yes, right? Can you hear me? Yes? Are you okay in the back? Great, thank you. We're going to start just by saying who has something they'd like to ask of any of our panelists. I'm going to ask that you recognize them specifically by their areas. We know we have two individuals that are dealing with our gun issues, but you're also, as a lawyer, representing several issues. So he may be able to speak on some of the other issues that you have questions about in terms of lawyers coming together and looking at DC and our ability to govern ourselves. And then, of course, we have our educators here and our young journalist that's done some great research. So where do we want to start? Oh, good.
So I don't have a question, I have a comment. I think this is awesome because oftentimes we see some of our more seasoned scholars actually speaking, and this was fabulous because it's exciting to see young people speaking and thinking about what lies ahead for our future, that these are stewards of trying to make sure that DC statehood passes and that we maintain the knowledge of our history. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And understand, this is a safe space. This is a safe space. So we get to say and talk about the things that are important to us. We have two hands. One, the young lady in the back came up first, but there you go.
My comment is that you know, it's very disheartening to know what guns do and what they're designed to do, which is to kill people. And they kill a lot of innocent people. There was a story yesterday, I think, on the MSN, you know, Yahoo News, about a young woman who was going through an intersection, and her car was hit by another car. It flipped over, and the man with an AK, whatever, number rifle jumps out and proceeds to pump 3 or 4 bullets into this woman who is a mother of 3. The reason why I mention that is because it appears that I don't want to be naive. You know, guns are designed to kill people. I assume they're designed to kill people of color. And I really would like to speak to the young woman who is a newspaper journalist, right? That's what you are. And the reason why I particularly like that is because I think that I would like to hear her opinion of where journalism should go in being able to bring out more of a moral fiber. I mean, we can't continue to have children killed and innocent people just so we can make sure we kill the right people, because we're killing some of the wrong people. And the NRA and organizations like that, I don't know what they do. I don't know if they blackmail our lawmakers or if they pay them off, but I would like to know, are they giving them money? And maybe somebody else can give them some more money.
Okay, thank you. So your question is,
what is the role of journalism in being able to create a balanced perspective that brings back a moral fiber and a conscience to America so we don't keep killing the wrong people?
Okay, thank you so much.
Well, that's a hell of a question. And I'll try to answer it the best I can. I think you're right that you look at statistics and you see that there are disproportionate amounts of black men and women who are being killed by guns. And that's something you can look up anywhere and figure that out. In terms of journalists being able to tell that story, I was really fortunate to be able to work at that nonprofit that doesn't have to worry about advertising or anything like that and able to tell these stories. They focus on telling the stories of victims, of survivors, of trying to put a human face to so many of those stories, but also share so much information about what groups like the NRA are doing. You can go and you can track online exactly how much the NRA is spending for or against a candidate. And if you look right now, just going through FEC filings, you can see that they are putting in 5 times as much to defeat certain candidates than they are to support any single ones. They spend more money on defeating candidates that they think will pass laws that can remove any sort of gun restrictions. But you look at other organizations that work more on the state level, and that's really where the difference is. It's those state elections, those state lawmakers that you really have to keep an eye out for, because they're the ones that can make the changes on a state level. On a federal level, it's almost not realistic to even talk about putting out some sort of gun legislation. You look at this summer alone, we had 4 bills come up in the Senate one night on gun laws, and not a single one of them passed. You had the House Democrats do a 26-hour sit-in, and they weren't able to get a bill up for a vote because there was a group of right-wing Republican lawmakers that said that they didn't want it to come up. So it's just not reasonable for it to come up at a federal level. It's more about looking at it from a state perspective.
Thank you. We have a question here, Jay. Yes.
Thank you all for your hard work, first of all. You've really been enlightening this evening. I wanted to ask the gentleman from Appleseed, to what degree do you connect your work, or does Appleseed connect its work with Eleanor Holmes Norton and the work that she does in that arena?
Yeah, we try to have a great relationship with everyone, Delegate Norton, the mayor, and the council. You know, it all has to be a team effort. You know, and in the past on the DC voting rights bill a few years ago, we and our lawyers worked together to help develop the legal architecture for that, and she was a great champion for that on the Hill, and you know, she's a great champion for local DC budget autonomy when that was, you know, defending the will of the people. In that, you know, it was passed by the council unanimously, supported signed by the mayor, and supported in court by the current mayor, and she's been a staunch advocate of that in Congress. And every year she's a big advocate for DC's ability to spend its own money on what its local leaders decide. So she's the champion on the Hill, as they say, and you know, we work well with everyone. Thank you.
Go ahead. Next.
Yes, I want to thank you all also, and I'm so glad that there are young people keeping the movement going. I'm with Stand Up for Democracy in DC. It's a statehood organization established in 1997. But first of all, I want to invite everyone here. We are having a statehood program and reception on the 21st of this month at the Wilson Building from 6 to 8, and it's part of the DC Host Committee to celebrate the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So it's free, everyone's invited. Come to the Wilson Building on the 21st of September, 6 to 8. I wanted to see, I don't know who would take this, but there has been an ongoing struggle, or I guess you would say controversy, between the supporters of voting rights and statehood. And the supporters of statehood say that it is the only way to go because it's the only thing. Once you become a state, no congressman, no senator, nobody can overturn statehood. Whereas if you got budget autonomy, if you got gun control laws, which you said, they can be overturned by someone else. So could you go over that controversy, please?
Would you be best?
Yeah. Yes, as many of you may know, the mayor and the council, the whole, you know, lots of DC is getting behind this new effort to push the next Congress to enact statehood. So there's been a process for reviewing a constitution, and then for the voters to be asked in an advisory referendum in November on the general election ballot whether they want their mayor and their council and their officials to go petition the next Congress for full statehood. And you know, this you know, full-throated effort by the DC government and DC residents, you know, its time has probably come, because as we've seen, there's no way that Congress is really resistant to giving anything. So you might as well go for the whole thing. And I think we're all really heartened to see everyone getting behind this effort. But yeah, that is a good point. That there is sort of you know, some people say we need have long said that we need to go for the whole thing. We need to go for full statehood. That's a better place to focus the energies than on voting rights or budget autonomy. But I think our view is that we should be pursuing everything. We should be pursuing full statehood and really going for that, which is what we're doing now. But also for the elements of statehood, because all these elements are gonna face a big uphill battle in Congress. But you know, even if you're just going for the elements of statehood, you take a little here, you take a little there, you get local budget autonomy, you get a vote in the House, and then once you accumulate these advancements, then it gets harder and harder to make the case that you can't have your democracy in DC. So I think all the pieces are part of the puzzle.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
This question is for Mr. Celotto. So, thinking about everything we've heard about sort of DC's unique position and hearing your talk, I'm curious what you think the lessons are that we can take from Bolling v. Sharpe for current issues with de facto segregation.
For de facto segregation, is that
Yeah.
what you said? Yeah, so I'll get a little bit into that. I think one of the lessons we can learn is that grassroots organizing really works. I think that's the biggest lesson I think that the Bolling case really teaches us about politics and life in general. And I can speak to that on so many levels. In part of my other work in my past life, when I did a lot of LGBT activism and advocacy, I worked on the marriage equality campaign in Maine in 2012, and we passed marriage equality in Maine. But what made that really unique was Maine in 2012, we were the first state to pass marriage equality by talking to voters and like by a vote. So it wasn't the legislator, it wasn't the governor signing an executive order. It was the people of Maine voted, yes, we want marriage equality. And the reason why we won that was because we went out and knocked on doors and called voters, and we had people come into the office. So like that is another really great example of how powerful grassroots organizing is. And I think that's what you learn a lot from Bolling, is that you had regular everyday people, again, like 12-year-old kids like Spotswood Bolling, his parents, Gardner Bishop, so many everyday people just came together in this city. And I think regarding de facto segregation, there's so much work to be done in this city around housing, especially. That's like the biggest issue, is that the majority of African American people in this city are living southeast of the river, living south of the Anacostia River, because they're getting pushed out of neighborhoods like this very one we're sitting in, and they're getting pushed out of Shaw. At one point in time, this neighborhood, U Street, Cardoza, and Shaw was the mecca of African American culture in the country, really. And this was the area where middle-class African American families lived, and that's not true anymore. Middle-class African American families now, if you're lucky, you live in Hyattsville. But there's nowhere in the city for African American people to live really affordably except Southeast DC, and that's where you see, unfortunately, the worst schools in this city. A lot of them are in Southeast DC. That was true then, and it's true now still. So really, like the two biggest takeaways I think we can learn is like grassroots organizing is really powerful, and that's what we're going to have to keep doing to get these victories. And the number one issue around schools and de facto segregation now is housing. We have to solve the affordable housing crisis in the DC, because there's not any affordable housing in DC, quite frankly. And that's like the biggest issue now at schools, is that working class, not just black families, but Latino families, Native American families, really families of color, are getting pushed out. And their students, their kids are suffering the most. So.
Hi. I was just wondering, what happens to DC's relatively strict gun laws if it does get statehood? Does that make it easier for those gun laws to be taken down in the Supreme Court or Congress?
Did you hear? Did you understand?
What do you mean, like
If DC becomes a state, is there like a review of its existing gun laws? Are they easier to repeal?
They get to, because there is a provision in the Constitution that allows Congress to interfere with any of DC's laws. So any sort of law that DC has, Congress is able to kind of step in and change it or enact their own law if they want to. If they're a state, that would essentially be eliminated. And they would be able to have control over their own gun laws the way any state does right now.
But I would add that of course, DC's laws, state or not, would still be subject to challenges in the courts, because the Second Amendment, of course, applies in the District of Columbia and in all the states. So even if you kept Congress out, it would still be of interest for litigation.
We have other questions. We have a couple, yes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about the DC gun laws and when it started. When the handgun law ban, was it part of the home rule, or was it actually an earlier law? I mean, how long was the ban on handguns in effect before it was struck down?
I believe the handgun in the home restriction, that went back to the late 70s, I believe. Yeah, so that would have been passed by the home rule government, the locally elected DC council. So.
Does that answer your question, sir? Yes, I think we have a young gentleman over here in the corner with his hand almost up.
Hi. I have a question for you about the education. I was curious, how effective, but more specifically, how plausible is mixed housing development as a solution to ensure fair education to all, regardless of one's socioeconomic background?
So I think I heard like half your question. Were you saying like mixed income housing, like how effective of a strategy would that be? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, make specific housing developments where it's like housing developments where it's mixed income, so you have some specific, where it's well integrated with high income, low income, middle income.
I think that's a great idea. I think you should run for office one day. That's a great idea. Like seriously, like mixed income housing is a great idea in theory. The problem with passing mixed income housing or getting it to go anywhere is that so many people. So if you want to build mixed income housing and like a nicer neighborhood, you said, right? Like a nicer, wealthier neighborhood. So let's say we propose to build mixed income housing in upper Northwest DC, like around American, like around that area. That's a really nice, wealthy, expensive neighborhood with some of the best schools in DC. I guarantee you the majority of families in that neighborhood would not want mixed income housing in their neighborhoods because a lot of people believe that when you build mixed income housing, particularly in areas that are middle class or affluent, that it drives down property values, that people aren't going to be able to sell their houses, that it brings in crime. So in theory, it is an awesome idea, and you are a super smart young man. Like, I love that idea. And mixed income housing would be a step and be a part of that solution to like how do we reverse this like de facto segregation, right? Which a lot of it does have to do with housing. But the other problem is that after the Bolling case was decided, particularly in the 60s and 70s, Washington D.C. saw a huge happening, I guess you could say, of what's called white flight, which is a sociological and historical term, which basically just means all the white people leave the city. That's like the most basic concept. So what happened in DC in the 60s and 70s was you had a lot of white families right after schools were segregated. They said, we don't want our little girl going to school. We don't want our white little girl going to school with a bunch of black boys. They're going to attack her. They're going to hurt her. They're going to be mean to her. So a lot of white families in the 60s and 70s left DC and they went to the suburbs. They went to places like Alexandria, Arlington, Bethesda, the surrounding like more affluent upper middle class suburbs in Maryland and Virginia. So that's also a really huge problem. So what you're asking kind of, and what historians and sociologists and education policymakers have been asking for a very long time, is how do we reverse 40 to 60 years essentially of white flight? Not just in DC. White flight is not just a problem that happened in DC that negatively impacted schools. It happened in Detroit. It happened in New York City. Basically almost any major urban community in the United States, you can identify white flight and housing as a major issue linked to education. So again, great idea. Run for office one day, and please convince people that mixed income housing is a great idea.
But let me just ask, Bryce, are we dealing with the reverse right now? Because they're coming back. They're all coming back. So the reverse is the situation right now. And those that are here that have been historically run away from, that are still here, holding on, trying to be a part of who they've always been as Washingtonians. Now we have an influx and we have gentrification. So it really is very interesting that, you know, we're having the reverse of that now. So how do you address that?
Yeah, that's a huge question. There's a reason why I'm not doing urban planning and that I'm becoming a teacher instead. But yeah, I don't really know how to answer that question, honestly, but I do want to say one thing, because I think it's been hit on a lot. In the cases of gun laws, you know, we've learned a lot tonight. I've learned a lot tonight personally about how Congress has interfered with gun laws, right? And how Congress has made it harder for DC to get things done. And I think Bolling, ironically enough, is kind of the opposite of that. Congress actually really helped the Bolling case a lot, especially because the Bolling case happened at the height of the Cold War, which, again, most people don't really recognize or pay attention to. But 52, 53, 54, it's the height of the Cold War. So optics-wise, it looked really bad for the United States that schools in the capital of what was supposed to be the free world were segregated, and that African-American students were going to lesser schools in the capital of the free world. So Congress, instead of impeding progress, actually said, oh crap, we have a huge problem because the Cold War and because this looks bad. And President Eisenhower was really concerned. So what is kind of funny and ironic about the Bolling case is that it became not just a domestic policy issue, but a foreign policy issue. Because literally the Soviet Union was using the fact that schools were segregated, specifically in DC, as propaganda for the Cold War. They were saying, the communist Soviet Union was saying, oh, look, Americans claim to be so, like, high and mighty and righteous, and they talk about freedom and democracy all the time. But black kids in the nation's capital are going to these schools that are completely inferior, that are crumbling, that are falling down. So, like, communism's clearly better. How can you say that democracy is great and America's great if African-American students in the nation's capital are going to really bad schools? And that triggered Congress to do all these reports and to do all this research. It triggered Congress to get funding to build oh my God, I'm completely blanking right now the name of the school. Oh, the Spingarn School, I think, where Elgin Baylor went. That was opened in like 48, 49. So Congress said, we have a real problem here. We actually need to do something. So they did pass funding to build new schools, and they did pressure President Eisenhower. And the last thing I'll say is, so another really key difference is after the Brown decision was passed, a lot of school districts, as a lot of you probably know, really were hesitant to actually implement the decision. You had school districts in South Carolina, Kentucky, Arkansas, predominantly the Deep South. They used that one little convenient phrase in the Brown decision, by all deliberate speed, to delay as long as possible in terms of integrating schools. That's why you had in Arkansas, the Little Rock Nine, the National Guard coming in. That happened everywhere except DC. Because DC, again, because of pressure from the federal government, because of pressure from Congress, and because of President Eisenhower's administrations, as soon as the Bolling decision came out, which was 54, it was like April, May 54, that fall, so literally 3 or 4 months later, DC schools were desegregated. Now, when I say that they were desegregated, I mean like 2 black kids went to an all-white school. But in their book, they said, look, all the schools in the Deep South waited forever, and they're delaying this. We did it right away. Like, we desegregated our schools right away, and that was because of pressure from the federal government. So, again, didn't really answer the question, but I do think it's like a fun juxtaposition to point out that in their situations, we're talking about Congress impeding progress in D.C. But in the Bolling situation, it was really Congress pushing progress. Of course, it wasn't because they actually care. Let's be really clear. They didn't actually care about the black students in Washington, D.C. They just cared about looking good and saying, like, oh, no, the nation's capital, schools are great here. Yeah, things might be kind of a problem still in Arkansas and North Carolina, despite the Brown ruling, but here in the capital of the free world, like, we got this. So just like a funny juxtaposition.
Thank you so much. Yeah. We're going to continue that framework, and then we'll be right to you.
I think Bryce's commentary is really interesting there, especially if you think about at the time of Bolling v. Sharpe, we didn't have a council who was elected by the people. You didn't have a mayor elected by the people. You had 3 commissioners appointed by the president, you know, not even D.C. residents, people who necessarily had anything to do with D.C., and they were approved by Congress. You know, so Congress back in those days really did do even more micromanaging of D.C. And now when D.C. actually has more control, Congress isn't micromanaging, you know, the day-to-day affairs, the streets, but they're stepping in on these hot-button social issues like guns and abortion and marijuana, needle exchange for a while. So the more control, so now 60 years later, D.C. has a lot more control over itself, and I guess Congress is being a little less helpful and a little more playing political games, perhaps, that advantage them.
And I think one of the things that we had a couple of questions come in that really brought up the issue of ethnicity, race, you know, and the way that so much of this kind of coincides with where we are in our country, what is going on in our presidential race, and just the how people are polarized around these issues. And many of the ones that we're here talking about really hit hard in our communities that are very marginalized. And so it's very difficult not to say, you know, well, what is this? Is this a black thing? Is this, you know, is this a race thing? Is it, you know, and what about all the rest of us that love the mixture and who we are and how diverse we are and how we love each other's flavor, and we're learning how to get along, but everybody wants to keep us divided. So I think that underneath all of this, sometimes it's very difficult to say, well, you know, let's just be honest. What is going on and why is it being affected that way? And I think that they're helping us, and they know and they want to be respectful, but at the same time, this is the truth and how we're mitigating our socialization in terms of what we're going to look like in the next 20, 40, 50 years. So we thank you for that. I see Mr. Chuck over there waiting to ask his question. Go ahead, sir.
A couple of questions. One is that, can you comment a little bit about charter schools and public schools and what's happening in that whole realm of charter schools and public schools? And perhaps you can come in on this the thought that while this city is becoming more diverse, and there are a lot of young millenniums, particularly whites, moving in, but many of them are here to stay. It's not a temporary place for them. And I think that as they marry and raise families, that they're not looking to put their kids in private schools. They're looking to make DC's public school system better because they're going to be more involved in it. And I see that as an interesting piece. And once again, I think that the challenge is perhaps in Ward 7 and 8 in terms of, but even there, when you look at the numbers of kids who go into charter schools, there's an amazing movement going on around it. And I'm an advocate for public schools more than anything else. But can you comment about the dichotomy of charter schools and public schools, and here in the district particularly, and perhaps throughout the country there's a move with charter schools that's taking place?
Did you understand?
Charter schools and public schools.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have a lot of personal feelings about charter schools, but from a policy and looking at a historical standpoint, I think charter schools, particularly in Washington, D.C., is, in my mind, almost another form of de facto segregation. Because, again, it's like what kids get to go to charter schools. You know, most charter schools often have lotteries, and there's tens and thousands of kids in some cases in a lottery for maybe 50 spots, 40 spots, or well, sometimes more. But, you know, so to me, I think there are a lot of good intentions behind charter schools in terms of, oh, we're going to set really high standards. We're really going to push students. We're going to have uniforms or have whatever to, you know, increase or improve behavior. So I think there are a lot of good intentions behind charter schools. But at the same time, I think that charter schools and funding especially, you're taking a lot of funding away from DC public schools. Like think about it. All the charter schools that are popping up, you know, all the money, because oftentimes education policy experts often say, well, charter schools are the solution because our public schools are failing, right? That's often like the rhetoric you hear. Where there's so many charter schools, and parents want to send their kids to charter schools because public schools suck. Public schools are failing. They're not teaching our kids. They're not preparing them for the real world. They're not preparing them for college or for jobs. But you have to ask yourself, if you're constantly taking money from those public schools to give to charter schools, of course the charter schools are going to be better. If you give me $10, but then take my $10 away and give it to Kevin, like, of course Kevin's probably able to do more stuff than I am, because now I have no money and he has $10, like, or $10 more added to what he already had. So I think it's a really big question of funding when you talk about charter schools versus public schools. And it makes me think of schools in D.C. like Dunbar High School. Dunbar High School in the 20th century, in the early 20th century and late 19th century, Dunbar High School was one of the best schools in the country.
not just one of the best black high schools in the country, it was one of the best high schools in the country, despite segregation in the early 20th century. And now, you know, Dunbar had a really rough patch from like the 70s to the 90s and even into the early 2000s. They recently built the new campus, and they're trying to rebuild the reputation of Dunbar, and they're trying to rebuild what it means to go to Dunbar High School. And I think of schools like Dunbar, and like those schools like Dunbar and Cardozo High School, so many high schools that have a lot of historical value in DC and really mean a lot to DC, they're not going to succeed if we keep funneling money to charter schools. They're just not. So again, I think there is a place for charter schools in education. I think a lot of charter schools are well-meaning, but I think a lot of the practices you can call into question, especially around discipline and high-stakes testing. And a lot of charter schools are very much zero tolerance, which generally leads to more black and brown students getting expelled or suspended and getting pushed into the school-to-prison pipeline. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be worked out with charter schools, and I think we really need to focus on, especially in D.C., rebuilding the infrastructure of D.C. public schools. And that's something that outgoing Chancellor Kaya Henderson really focused on. And I'm very, very sad she announced she's resigning because Chancellor Henderson was really focused on rebuilding the infrastructure of DCPS, particularly in low-income neighborhoods in Ward 8 and those schools. So.
I want to also just say I've been looking into that a little bit, and I'm not sure how many of you have. I know Michael Moore, the film producer, put out a new piece on Finland educational system, and they don't allow private schools. They don't allow any private schools. And there's, I'll let you read up on it, but their kids go to school 3 to 4 hours a day. There is no competitive sports or any level of hyper competition in those schools, et cetera, et cetera. Finland didn't know if they were going to fail or not. But what they did know was that children were not growing up as children, and they were not happy in their learning environment. And they just decided to change the construct or the paradigm of what education is so that children can be children, grow up happy, and be placed according to passion, according to their unique learning styles, et cetera, et cetera. Well, since that inception, and I can't speak specifically because I wasn't prepared to do that, but they've been ranking in the top 1, 2, 3 in testing, never below 5 for the last 10 years or so, and have had the top spot. And so United States educators and educators from around the world have been flocking to Finland and saying, how can you do this? How is this happening? Of course, they have a more homogeneous society. However, they are totally invested in a child enjoying education and understanding what's in it for them specifically. So that's something that maybe some of you might want to look at. What is Finland doing? Okay, we have another question there and there. Oh, she's saying something. Sorry.
I think the charter school is another example of Congress imposing some policy on DC also. Because I remember there was some deal with Mary Landrieu of Louisiana. She's a senator from Louisiana. And she made some deal with somebody in the DC government or somebody on the Hill where they decided to fast-track charter schools in DC. So that's another example of that imbalance.
And keep it short, because we got about, how many questions do we have out there? Okay.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think the way that school funding goes down, whether it be public charter schools or DCPS, it is very much controlled by Congress as well. So that's like another important thing to note. And I also want to note, you know, again, I'm not anti-charter school. I actually went to a charter school in 7th grade in Las Vegas, Nevada. So I'm not like, charter schools are the worst thing ever. Oh my God, burn them all down. But I do think there needs to be more regulation. There needs to be more conversations about what these schools are actually doing. And I do think if you really want to fix, I can talk about this for days, but if you want to talk to me afterwards, feel free. If you really want to fix education in this system, and this is all I'm going to say, if you really want to fix education in the United States of America, fix the way we recruit teachers. That is the number one. That is the number one problem with education in the United States. It's the way we recruit, train, and retain and pay teachers.
Okay, so she said your question, huh? Great minds think alike.
Bryce, it was pretty astounding to hear that Brown versus Board wouldn't apply to DC. What is the rhyme or reason for when a Supreme Court decision would not apply to the district if there was another Brown versus Board today?
Well, it's really just it's really just the 14th Amendment. So that's the biggest thing. It's the fact that the lawyers in the Brown case, so that the Brown case was led by Thurgood Marshall and his team of litigators from NAACP, and it was really the decision to use the 14th Amendment. That's the biggest thing. So it's really hard to make the case that any legal argument using the 14th Amendment applies to DC. It's hard to make that legal argument because the 14th Amendment is so specific with the Equal Protection Clause. At least the Equal Protection part of the 14th Amendment, I should say, is so specific to states and states only. So if you made a legal argument where it solely hinged on that Equal Protection Clause, it would be nearly impossible to make the legal argument and for case law to stick where it applies to Washington, D.C. So that's really what it was. It's the state-specific language in the Equal Protection Clause, which is why Hayes and the other lawyers had to use the Fifth Amendment, which is more a broader amendment. Like the term liberty, right, is very broad. You can define liberty and apply liberty almost however you want. So it gave them more leeway in terms of the language, the specific language. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Anyone else want to say something? Okay, we have another question. Okay, yes. Thank you, sir.
Can somebody explain the ballot question about statehood on the ballot this fall? I heard that the guys that drafted it said they would be the congressmen if the statehood thing passed. Can that be fixed?
Oh yeah,
people? How come people in the country don't know about the lack of statehood for DC? Do we need a better news platform like the Intercept DC? I heard the Intercept started a Brazilian version. You guys familiar with that media platform?
Yeah.
They have a good article about the arms industry today and how they gave like hundreds of millions of dollars to Clinton Foundation and hired Clinton's campaign manager. The Intercept has a good article about money and weapons in today's edition of the Intercept. So could we get a Intercept DC to teach people about statehood in DC and stuff like the congressman meddling in DC gun laws?
That's for both of us. But to your point about can we educate people about DC's situation, I think that's a really important point, and a lot of people don't know about that. I know that there have been polls that say, nationwide, do you know that DC doesn't have voting rights or the same rights as people in other states? And they say, I don't know. Do you think that, and when they know about that, then they think that DC should have more rights. So they're ambivalent when they don't know, and when they do know, they really care and they don't understand what it means. And you know, there's even misconceptions by members of Congress, at least in my view, of what their role is under the district clause. So the Constitution says that they can legislate in all cases whatsoever for DC, but it doesn't require them to do so. The whole purpose of the district clause, this is from James Madison himself in the Federalist Papers, was to protect the federal government from being threatened by riots or the people in the state, because the framers had just been in Philadelphia where they were chased out by a riot, and the Pennsylvania authorities wouldn't protect them. And the other point is so that no one state has undue influence over the Congress. And none of those rationales has anything to do with Congress stepping in and saying you can't spend your own money, you can't spend it on abortion, you can't do needle exchange, you have to have certain types of gun laws. That doesn't really have anything to do with the purpose. The way Congress has exercised its authority under the district clause is not really consistent with what the purpose of the district clause was in the Constitution. So I think some education about the real purpose of why DC is the way it is would be helpful for everyone. Oh, about the ballot question. I'm not sure exactly how that was resolved. I believe that there would be that the current delegate to Congress would be the representative, and then there would be another election shortly thereafter. I believe that may have been what happened. I know there was a push by some of the current statehood delegation to have them take the seat, but I'm not sure exactly how that turned out. It's an advisory referendum of whether I can't remember the exact language, but it's do the voters want the mayor and the council to petition Congress for statehood under the borders as outlined in this process, and do you accept the Republican form of government which is required of all states, and do you and under the Constitution that DC is considering?
So it sounds like another Humanitini to me. to get very deep into that, right? Do we have other questions? We have one here in the front.
Hi. One more time. With regard to the charter school versus DCPS, I've worked in both as an English language arts tutor. And fortunately, I prefer to be a tutor because getting caught up in the bureaucracy of either is crazy. Yeah. And I've seen teachers truly, truly burn out in both, on both sides of the issue. Charter schools, however, I tend to favor least because of observing how children are handled in this particular, I won't say, let me not demonize all charter schools, because obviously the one you went to, you're very happy with.
It was awesome. It was the coolest school ever. Yeah.
Okay. But I work in one as an example, which I consider not one of the best, and I will not name it, and it is in the far southeast. But anytime you find it necessary to expel a second grader, that to me speaks to a strange kind of issue of the teachers not being able to, grown people not being able to take care of a 7-year-old or 8-year-old child. Yeah. Also, a child reaches the 3rd grade and cannot tell time. No concept whatsoever of telling time. Yeah. And I even spoke with some of the teachers to find out how that happened. And it was like one teacher just kind of said to me, oh, she just fell through the cracks. Yeah. That doesn't work for me. But when you say charter schools, my antennas go up because there are a lot of studies that prove that charter schools nationally are not better than public schools. They are not doing a greater job. Some of them are good, but there are studies that show that they're not. And so all of this money has been funneled into the schools. Yeah. And they supposedly have these innovative programs that's supposed to enhance the child's experience, enrich the child's experience. But from personal observation, the intensity with which the child is receiving the academics, along with the social, cultural environment, there are too many children, in my experience, who are getting missed, just as they are in many of the public schools, DC public schools. So that's just my sharing with that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, you know, you do see a small handful of charter schools that are doing really good work. I'm sure you've all seen like a feel-good video on your Facebook feed at one point in time of one of those charter schools in Chicago, especially. That's like all black boys and they all go to college. Like, of course, there are always like a few really great stories and a few good schools out there. But again, like specifically speaking to your point on discipline and like how you have second graders getting expelled, right? And that again like speaks volumes to what a lot of researchers in the past 10 to 15 years have started calling the school to prison pipeline. Basically, when you have students in schools that are usually black and brown students and or LGBT identified students who get suspended and disciplined at disproportionate rates. So not to pick on you, but let's say I punch a kid in the playground. Now, of course, children should not punch kids in the playground. I'm not advocating this. Bear with me. So let's say I, as a young black kid in like 3rd grade, punch a kid in the playground. He does the same exact thing as a young white 3rd grader punches a kid in the playground. he might get in-school suspension. Oh, don't do it again. You know, you shouldn't punch kids. Play nice with your classmates. I will most likely get suspended, like out of school suspension, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. And you see a lot of that, especially in charter schools, that disproportionate amount of disciplinary practices being handed down. So that's where you have examples of second graders getting expelled. Well, if you're a second grader and you already have an expulsion on your record, what does that do when you go to middle school, high school, et cetera? And then when you're working with older students, like I work with 7th through 12th graders predominantly, if you're a 9th grade kid in Southeast DC, and you get suspended from your school for not having a pencil, which I know sounds absurd, but it happens all the time. Well, what are you going to do? If you're not in school and you live in Southeast DC and you're a 9th grade, you're a 14-year-old black boy, you're going to be out on the streets, you're going to be home alone because your parents are working, and it just provides more opportunities for trouble. So a lot of charter schools and public schools alike, both contribute to that pipeline a lot, and you do see a lot of those practices in charter schools. So it is something to be wary of, regardless if you're in public DCPS or public charter schools here in the district. So.
And I have a background in education, so I have a lot of things to think about. Well, I think one of the things you also have to think about is where did charter schools come from in the first place, and they came from as this alternative to the public school system. So I think what we essentially have to do is we have to really look at our public school systems and say, okay, this isn't working, this isn't working, this isn't working, and that's why kids are leaving. That's why they're looking at those alternatives when really we shouldn't even need an alternative in the first place. The public school system is what should be working because that's what we all pay for, that's what our taxes go to. And I went to public school, but I went to public school in suburban Massachusetts, which is entirely different than any kid in DC going to public school, no matter which area of the city. So it's really about examining those sorts of issues, looking at funding, looking at Chapter 70 funding within states, figuring out exactly that, making sure that the money's going where it's supposed to be going, and also that the teachers who are being trained in the right ways. There's a lot of experimentation in teacher training right now. You have programs where they're taking the teachers and they're throwing them right into the classroom. After a year of extensive courses, you have teachers who are being thrown into the classroom after 6 weeks of workshops. There's a lot of conversations about what works best.
We have probably only time for, this will have to be our last question over here, because we have about 5 minutes. But I also want to say just quickly, how does privatization play a role in this? I think some of this is really an issue of privatization, how capitalism says, where can we make the new money? And so if I can make money with charter schools, if I can make money on the prisons, if I can make money, so I think underneath this, as a society, as a culture, we have to start looking at where is this energy coming from in the culture to make money off of that which we have relegated to our government to do for all of us. So I just want to say that, Mr. Chuck.
Yeah, my question is about guns and what the law has done. And I'm wondering, I grew up in the South, so I grew up with guns in our houses and homes, as many people do. And I wonder, with the legislation, any kind of gun control, that those who shoot each other don't always get their guns, apply for their guns that they're out there to get. And it seems to me that some of the people that I've talked to who want to have a gun in their house, and it seems that the district is making it difficult for them because they're in fear of somebody breaking in. Maybe the man travels and the wife has to be there by themselves, and that there's a group of people who find it difficult that they should not be able to have a gun in their house for safe protection. And have you some thoughts about that difficulties that particularly people who are moving into the city? I think in a lot of communities, like people in parts of the Southeast, those who got guns, who grew up, they got a gun to try to protect themselves. But the people who get the guns and shoot other blacks most of the time, they don't go through a gun check or anything. There's a method to get them. But for people who are now living in the city, moving into the city, and they just want to feel safe, but the government is making it difficult for them to feel safe. They don't want to carry it out. They just want to know that if something happens in our house, I can be protected. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a really good point and an interesting point. I mean, we've been talking about Congress interfering with the district's local decisions, but even within the district, not everyone agrees with it. Some people in D.C. supported charter schools, and it was Congress who made the charter schools. You know, people in D.C., a lot of people don't agree with the way the council legislates on guns. So they may welcome Congress stepping in sometimes and saying, you know, we need to have more gun laws that are more in line with the Constitution. But I think maybe the overarching principle that guides at least our work is that, you know, that may be the case, that there's different opinions about how or what the law should be, but that those laws should be made by the locally elected officials, the ones closest to the people. So that's you know, in our briefs we've urged deference to the council because the council is elected by the people. They know the local situation. But yeah, that's a good point. Not everyone agrees with things, and sometimes you actually have DC residents, you know, hoping and urging Congress to step in certain areas because they don't agree with the council. So you can't do that in Maryland or Virginia. There's not always that outlet, but here in DC, yeah, it is possible for Congress to make laws that some residents may agree with, that their own local officials won't agree with.
I think you're absolutely right. There are people who have guns that don't have them licensed, that they've been in their families, that they've been passed down. That's a reality that we live with and that we face. And the fact is that there are rules that do permit you to keep a gun in your home. DC versus Heller established that precedent for people to have that individual right to have a gun. But you are able to get a concealed carry permit if you fall within those parameters. And in many states, you're able to get it very easily. And some states even permit open carry, which means you don't even need to have any sort of license. You can just walk around with a gun. That's under a lot of scrutiny right now. Police chiefs say that it really complicates their ability to police an area and take care of an overall population. And there's definitely a right to own a gun for self-defense and for whatever sort of self-protection a person or an individual feels that they need. But if you look at the studies, if you look at places where there are rates of gun ownership, the argument is that you own a gun to protect yourself. But where the rates of gun ownership are high, or where the homicide rates are the highest in the country, and it's also the places, it's the states where women are more likely to be killed in a domestic violence situation because a gun is the most lethal way to kill a woman. It's situations like that that you really have to consider, and it becomes a cost-benefit analysis in that end.
Thank you. Now, we have one young lady that's been, your hand is up. We have to hear from her. This is the last question. I wish but please stay afterwards because our guests are here for this evening, at least a few more minutes.
You know, this is still back to a full circle question. I asked earlier what we could do about the moral fiber of our country because hate is stronger than love. And we can't kill all the people that they want us to kill, whoever they is. And I mean, the whole thing is this is not the Wild Wild West. And you know, you can shoot people at the door, but you still have to answer to a greater power at some point in time for your actions. And the problem I'm having is that when I listen to Donald Trump and whether you're looking at MSNBC or whether you're looking at Fox News, the whole commentary, and then Rachel Maddow made a very interesting point about this is historical for us. The idea that hate, and we've got to have somebody to hate, and then we've got to kill the people that we hate. And I'm really concerned about where is there, and I would like for somebody in this room, maybe up on the panel, to tell me where is the moral conscience in this country? Is it going to grow, or are we just going to perish as the sun comes closer to burning up all the grass in my yard, and certainly me one day? I mean, is there a moral conscience is what I'm asking. And if so, where is it?
Thank you. And he wants to say something, and you might want to speak to that.
So I think what you're getting at, what the larger question you're getting at, I think, is how do we teach people and how do we talk about social, political, and historical issues like we are tonight in this room, but how do we continue having that larger conversation? Because you always kind of hear the phrase, like, you have to know your history so you don't repeat it, right? And this is where me, as an emerging teacher, comes in. So one of the really annoying things that I deal with a lot, and my friend Evie, who's in the audience, I was joking with them today about this, is I look at job postings a lot for teachers, and school districts hiring teachers, and oftentimes these job postings will say, oh, we're only looking for teachers in high-need areas, which means science, technology, and math. Social studies, all of a sudden, is not considered a high-need area. So no. So I'm getting there. So I'm getting there. So I say that to say, I think now more than ever, social studies is a high-need area in schools, and that with all the issues going on with Donald Trump, with police brutality, with crime, with gun violence, I think now more than ever, social studies is a really high-need area in schools, because I think that is a way where you get to those issues, right? And the more people, the way you teach those issues in schools, and talk about and have these hard conversations with students and with young people. And lots of educators don't think that's possible, but it is. I taught a class this summer at Brown for 3 weeks to a group of 9th through 12th graders about riots. We talked about riots and social change through riots. We talked about the 1967 Detroit riots. We talked about Stonewall. We talked about the Miss America pageants in 1968 where there were protests. I had really difficult conversations this summer with 9th through 12th grade kids from an urban school district. So I did, and my co-teachers did, and my teachers at Brown did what so many educators don't think is possible. We can't have these conversations in the classroom. They're too hard. We can't talk to high school students about Donald Trump. We can't talk to high school students about, gun violence, but that's not the case of things, and we can have these conversations, and I think that is one place where we start.
Yeah, I think what is happening is that what you're saying is the moral fiber that's decaying, but remember, that's an ethical issue. What is moral fiber? Who gets to say what moral fiber is? And so this is where we have this problem, because we have this moral fiber, and we have that moral fiber, and we have that moral fiber, and then and everybody's going to say, well, my moral fiber is right. So, but we know, ultimately, if there's pain involved, if there's hurt involved, if there's destruction involved, there's a problem, and we need to collectively look at it that way as opposed to going into our separate camps. So we hear you, and we've taken these young people to task tonight, but of course, they don't have answers to problems we have not been able to solve ourselves, and we have allowed them to inherit a culture that is full of fear. And so I think this moral fiber issue is at the crux of everything that's happened. We just have to decide what that's going to look like over the next 20 years for all, or 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, for all of us. And that is the problem, which again is another Humanitini, right? Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Bryce, Celotto, Jacqueline, yes, Thomsen, and Kevin Hilgers. And I'm Pamela Perkins. Thank you so much for being here with DC Humanity. And see us afterwards. Please feel free to continue to talk. And Jay wants to say something at the end.
We have a lottery. How many people here have tickets?
Thank you.
I need someone to pick the ticket. Let's see who's won the prize. Okay, does anyone have ticket 584? Congratulations. All right, thank you all again for coming. We look forward to seeing you all October 6th, where we're going to talk about Marion Barry and Dream City.